Okay, let's get started. First, solder selection, 0.8 millimeter. Not too big, not too small. Kind of like a Goldilocks thing. Get mill clean if you can. That'll help the solder stick better. Go lead free if you can. It's a little bit harder to use, but doesn't come with the toxic side effects of lead. All the techniques I'm about to show you work just fine for leaded solder as well as lead-free solder. I just prefer lead-free. This is the solder that I use. It's SAC 305. Lead-free needs more heat. You do need to be a bit pickier with your soldering iron. Let's look at that next. My soldering iron is 60 watt. It comes with two different ways to clean the solder off of the soldering iron. One is by pushing it into this brass and twisting it around to get solder off the tip. The other is a wet pad that you can wipe the solder off. I prefer the brass. It lasts longer, less replacements, and it just seems to work better. The higher wattage iron, the better. I try to aim for about 60 watts. It's a nice blend between cost and utility. You can go with less wattage if you're using lead solder. If you go too low a wattage, you risk the chance of overheating your part before the solder even melts, and you end up burning your electronics. Not a good thing. A higher wattage iron will be able to keep its heat better than a low wattage iron. All right, before we fire up the soldering iron, safety first. Safety glasses are critical because no one likes solder in the eye. It's just not a good look. Next up, a fume extractor or a fan to blow the fumes away. Just not a great idea to have solder going up into your nostrils. It's very irritating. Soldering iron's turned on, set to 750 degrees Fahrenheit because I'm using lead-free solder. If you're using leaded solder, 650 degrees might be a better starting point. Okay, so here's the technique. Take the soldering iron, place it on the pad and the standoff at the same time. Count to 2, and then you start pushing in the solder. The solder I push in about 1 millimeter worth. That's generally enough to solder a small joint like this. So let's see what that looks like. So soldering iron on, 1, 2, and then I push the solder into that little crevice, and then I hold for another 1 or 2 seconds, and then I pull the soldering iron off. Now if you look at that, that ends up creating a nice conical joint. That's really what we're looking for. Let's show that a couple more times here. Okay, so soldering iron on, you create a little corner. You push the solder into that corner. Let the soldering iron sit for 1 or 2 more seconds, and then you pull it off. Soldering iron on, count to 2, push in the solder, pull the solder away, and let the iron sit for 1 or 2 more seconds. You'll notice that when the soldering iron is sitting on there, the solder actually gets sucked down into that hole. That's exactly what we want to have happen. That's basically getting the solder all the way down and making a nice connection all the way through the joint rather than just on the surface. So that's why it's important to leave that soldering iron on there just a little bit after you remove the solder from the joint. Let's look at what a bad soldering joint might look like. That's often caused by the person not holding the soldering iron on the soldering joint long enough. So let's take a look at that. If I almost start to melt the solder at the same time as I have the iron on there, what happens is I end up getting something that looks like this. See, instead of a nice conical joint like you see here on this side, you have a round ball on this side. That's not a good solder joint. The easy way to fix that, hold the iron on the soldering joint just a little bit longer and let that pull the solder down into the hole. Another main issue that I see is too little solder. So if you put too little solder on, we'll put it maybe in the center one here. There. What it looks like is a flat joint. You'll see there's no cone to it. And the danger there is that you leave a little bit of an air gap for water and moisture to get in, and over time, that can cause that joint to fail. This one's easy to fix by just adding a little bit more solder. The last problem that I want to emphasize is pay attention to the end of the soldering iron. If you start seeing a lot of solder build up on that soldering iron, use a little bit less solder on the next joint so you don't waste any time putting your soldering iron through the cleaner. Let's look at just a little bit larger component. You want to put more solder on so that the joint can support the higher amperage that potentially is going through these. Okay, so let's take a look at this. I'll use the same technique, soldering iron on the pad, make a nice corner to go ahead and push that solder into. And you'll notice I pushed a lot more solder in the last one to fill up that entire pad. Still looking for that same conical shape, to make sure you've pushed enough solder into the joint. It's the same technique that we saw with the smaller soldering joints. So the last type of component that I'll show you is actually one of the more common ones. This is kind of handy because the way to keep these on, after you push them through, just make sure they're fully seated into that board, and then you can just bend these prongs outward. The thing holds on itself. From there, find a good angle to put the soldering iron on there, create a nice little cavity to start pushing solder through. Push it through, let it soak in, and if you need to twist your part around, be sure to do so to get a nice area to go ahead and push that solder into. So solder in and then iron off. And that's all there is to it. Make sure you wash your hands when you're done soldering, whether you use lead-free or not. So how do you learn to solder beyond this? My first solder joints, they looked terrible. After practicing a lot, they still looked pretty terrible. After a while though, you start getting used to it and you almost turn into a machine just being able to put that solder in just the right amount, just the right speed. I'd encourage you to practice your soldering skills on a project that doesn't matter before a project that does. I like to use fun kits to keep me entertained. This is one of my first soldering projects. You can see burn marks all over the place. It's a little drum set on a circuit board. But we're all done here, so we're going to go ahead and reinstall this in the lamp and get back to reading. I'll be posting a lot of tutorials on tools that I use most often with just the bare necessities of what you need to know to be able to make stuff using 3D printers, electronics, and circuit boards. And be sure to subscribe if you want to learn how to install new under cabinet lights based on some of the same circuit boards that we saw here today. Happy soldering, and we'll see you in the next video.